I've been told that I'm one of those people who, if you ask me what time it is, I'll tell you how to make a clock. So I decided to write this out so I could time it within my time frame, not have this young woman leaping up and waving that thing at me, and apparently this other young woman live tweeting it. Albert Einstein. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. William Ophuls. New programs within the old paradigm will simply recreate the old problems in a new guise. When two of the smartest people who've ever lived come up with basically the same idea, you can be pretty sure that they're right. What we're facing in our corrections and sentencing policies today, what the recent critique of the Justice Reinvestment demonstrated very well, is that the same processes and ideas behind the work groups that bring us whatever changes we get in state policy right now will not solve the problems we face in corrections in the future any more than the last big reform fad, which included the same players, the same perspectives the state sentencing commissions did. One of the major reasons for this is the silo mindset of the participants in these efforts. The same basic people with the same basic way of looking at their policy world, the same basic range of possible changes that will be acceptable to them. There's very little coming out of any state reform effort, notwithstanding the ones Judy just talked about, that wouldn't have been on the same list of options 2 decades ago. I know, I was there 2 decades ago. This is not unusual for any set of policy participants, much less corrections and sentencing, but the problem is that, as our 2 previous discussants have described, the solutions to our problems are not going to come out of the same silo that incubated them. Let me give you a quick example. Everyone in this room likely knows that the fastest growing age group in practically every state's prison system is what we call aging inmates, those 50 years of age and older. Either aging into that category while in prison or coming in those age groups for their latest offense, these inmates cost prison systems in terms of health care, recreation counseling, facility retrofitting, variety of other areas. Those in the 50 to 60 age group cost 2 to 3 times what the usual inmate costs. Those 60 to 70, 3, 4, 5 times. Those 70 and up, 8, 10, 12 times. This is not news to you, but maybe this is. It certainly never got talked about in any of the JRI projects I worked on, except in Oklahoma, where I was the one providing the data instead of being the consultant. It only got talked about, but never figured into calculations in the states where I worked on sentencing commissions. What? Consider the call to divert offenders from prison to lower the cost of incarceration in a state. If you're adding inmates 50 and over at the same time you're diverting younger inmates, as virtually all the usual items found in JRI proposals do, for every inmate you have aging into one of those older categories, you'll have to divert 2, 3, 5, 8, 12 times the inmates just to hold the costs even. You hear projections of 1,000 offenders diverted and think, well, that avoided the cost of a new prison. Not if you've added 300, 400 inmates in that 50 and over category. The point is that these points are rarely, if ever, brought up in the discussions of reforming corrections and sentencing in the work groups and commissions made up of the same participants with the same lack of awareness or concern about the issue. Aging inmates are not inside the silo of their attention and may as well be on a different planet, even though their impact can scuttle much of anything the work group or commission might be willing to recommend. You see the same thing regarding issues of program implementation or later evaluation of progress, because those areas are just not what the usual participants in these efforts are ever concerned about. This illustrates why we have to use this opportunity, as Todd said, to step outside the silo, to think beyond the usual remedies and nostrums that are commonly offered. Our reform work groups and commissions will not do what is necessary with this future facing us, a future of continued pressure on state and local budgets for years to come because 1, deferred but arriving bills due, and 2, incoming and unprecedented problems, because they just can't. They literally do not have the ability, the mindset, the thoughts that will be necessary. What happens when we step outside the silo in which corrections and sentencing policy has been made for the last 3 decades? What do we see? As it happens, we can see at least 3 very doable options that would let us cut prison populations to levels that would free the resources to build the positive feedback systems that the previous speakers have described. First, in every state can examine its laws and constitution to structure systems that require counties to take more responsibility for the sentences they give offenders. We always hear about the drivers of prison population increases, with some saying they're drug convictions or mandatory minimums, others saying they are sentence lengths and time served. These are symptoms, not causes. The drivers of state prison population growth are DAs and judges who use those laws and pronounce those sentences on behalf of counties which do not have to pay a dime for their imposition. The state hands the counties its credit card, pulls up in front of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse and says, all you can eat. And get some take home too. Many counties and their officials will still eat prudently, but practically every state has a number of counties that disproportionately load up their doggy bags at state taxpayer expense. Every sentence they issue is a state budget decision. And no amount of "you can't put a price on justice" claims actually prevents you from actually having to put a price on justice. That charging of the state credit card has to stop. Carrots, sticks, both, whatever, all can be used to force counties to pay their share of the freight. When Ronald Reagan can use this approach as the last governor in California to reduce prison population levels by the levels we're talking about here now, this is not a solution to be feared. How do we allocate what the counties should be required to divvy up? That leads to the second option. Every state should create a sentencing information system filled with data on offenders and offenses, demographics and assessment scores, sentence lengths and time served, program participation, and institutional behavior. It can be done as a rule simply with the data from a corrections department, but the additional data from courts, prosecutors, juvenile justice, substance abuse, and mental health agencies, health, housing, education, employment, all the other important social programs could be fruitfully used. To avoid politics and game playing as much as possible, these systems should be housed and maintained in a respected independent unit, such as a nonprofit or a university. Perhaps some here could suggest possibilities for their states. The data from this system could be analyzed to demonstrate in the aggregate that sentences and time served of such and such length for such and such assessed offenders tended to produce recidivism rates, or conversely survival rates, of such and such amount. The more variables in the data, the more precise the categories. In other words, sentence lengths and time served can be identified for their public safety payoffs in comparisons with other sentences and time served. We can produce public safety sentences and identify the sentences and time served associated with higher recidivism and less public safety. We were able to do it in Oklahoma just with the data we had in our department, which gets us back to the counties. Regular reports can be issued detailing those counties, those judges, those DAs with sentences associated with higher dangers to public safety. Since people of the state are likely to be in agreement with the goal of maximum public safety, all those taxpayers could legitimately be expected to pay for this public safety amount of a sentence and time served. However, why should taxpayers in one county, satisfied with the 3-year sentence on average for a third-time Berg 2, that has also produced the best payoff in reduced recidivism, have to pay for the average 7-year sentences of counties that insist on judgments that actually add risk of more crime and victimization, according to the data in the sentencing information system? I frequently heard judges in conservative areas of states I worked in tell me they didn't feel the values of their community were reflected in any sentencing guidelines based on the decisions of judges in urban counties. Why should those urban counties be bound by their conservative brethren any more than the conservative brethren want to be? So the answer to one way counties could start paying their way in our prison costs would simply be to require them to pay the state for any sentences beyond what the data indicate maximize public safety after the inmate is released. Their community values would still be recognized and respected, but those in the state who don't share those values or who value public safety over the additional justice premium being added on won't have to see their tax dollars go for all that. Is that outside the silo enough for you? There are clearly other things we can do. The third option would be to recodify the state's criminal code with the goal of reducing prison populations as the guiding force. The variety of things that could be done are well outside the silo, but not unheard of. Low-level offenses could be decriminalized or legalized, not just pot possession. Rethink if, given the resources at hand and the actual enforcement of these laws should still even be a medium priority anymore. Move offenses and or their adjudication out of our criminal processing system and into the civil arena or mediation formats of the many types out there. Reassign treatment of offenders with substance abuse or mental health needs to public health remedies and to professionals and agencies better equipped to deal effectively with them than jails, probation officers, or prisons. Note that the added benefit of all these outside the silo options is the removal of the usual inside the silo participants from active involvement in the implementation of these possibilities. Since so much of justice reinvestment and other efforts depends on the famous buy-in of stakeholders, that is, practitioners who hold stakes over any proposals that seriously threaten their domains, power bases, and professional standing, the resulting proposals, based as they inevitably are on the famous consensus of the work group, will never disrupt any of the existing status quo enough to generate the system change necessary. These options I've just described take those holders of stakes out of the loop and leave them little opportunity to sabotage or ignore. One last benefit of these options is Gordian knot slashing swords. One reason the JRI reforms don't get as much done as their promoters would like is because they and the reform stand at one end of the spectrum of options possible for public sanctions, with no change from prisons as our default on the other end. What these options do is to broaden the reform end of that spectrum, making the usual package of JRI-type reforms more moderate, more centrist. With demonstrated support for what I'm talking about here, JRI then becomes more reasonable. And its proponents can use the threat of legitimate consideration of these outside the silo options as hammers to get the usual opponents to the table with actual impactful compromise now possible, not the Cool Whip results we've been getting. If they were smart, the JRI funders would pay people like me to blare the options into every state and make JRI options more palatable. I'm still waiting for those calls. These are just quick hits at what is possible. We all recognize that the fruition of these outside the silo concepts is a lot more complex than I've made them sound, and would take a lot of work and perseverance as well as political skill and guts. But my point is that we do have options. We are not bound to those inside the silo who have held up serious reform for decades. We can move effectively without their approval and with reasonable expectations for success. As the Little Hoover Commission, another batch of very smart people, said about California a few years back, we don't need another report to sit on a shelf. We don't need another executive session, work group, commission to tell us what to do. We know what to do. It's a matter of leadership, commitment, and will. The report that Judy, Todd, and their co-authors issued shows the long-term vision of what our communities can look like if we get ourselves outside the silo and on the right track for once. We don't need more talking. It's time to walk. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. It's so great to be here at John Jay. This is an institution that has been near and dear to my heart for the fabulous research it's produced over the years, and I'm just thrilled to be here with colleagues whose work that I've admired for years. One of the benefits, really one of the many benefits of working in a large national foundation like the Atlantic Philanthropies and others that I've worked in over my years in the field is aside from the catered lunches and the fact that everybody is really nice to you almost all of the time, is the bird's eye view that the position affords you to sometimes look over an entire field of work and sometimes across several fields of social change at the same time. Although you would think that our billionaire donors who pay our salaries are immune to the recession, in fact, they feel the pinch or tell us that they feel the pinch. And so staff at foundations these days are increasingly staffing more than one issue at a time. And I think the benefit of that is actually that it gives us a little additional perspective. We program officers also often get invited to meetings with grand titles like, alliance building across movements and the effect of globalization on just about everything, whether it's gay marriage or microbreweries in Brooklyn, you name it. And then there's the fact that after a few years in philanthropy, I think one's skills as a lawyer or a criminologist or whatever fields we came from tend to atrophy, such that we can really only think big and grand thoughts rather than about the micro, messier details of actually making change on the ground. So whether that, précis, qualifies as a compelling reason or just a weak excuse, I wanted to use my time this morning to take a somewhat broader view and call for a macroeconomic analysis of how we got here, as well as how we might get out of here, and how we might leverage reform underway in parallel movements to hasten the end of an era of mass incarceration. First, let me just say that I completely concur about the need for policy and administrative reforms that alter sentencing lengths and reduce terms of probation and parole. As Todd and Judy and Michael have said, we have to attend to the length of sentences if we're actually going to get this right. And we have to focus more intently on not just how many people are coming through the prison gates, but actually how long they stay. At the same time, it seems to me essential that we think in larger terms about changing societal incentives to do that and how we actually build the political will to make some of these changes. As we all know, the weak economy in the states has provided a major opportunity to scale back prison commitments as states realize that they can no longer afford the incarceration habit. But state budgets also wax and wane. And I know I frequently talk to advocates in the field who worry that when the state fiscal situation looks a little bit better, we might return to our old practices. But I would posit that incarceration, or really better stated, racialized policies of mass criminalization, which sometimes result in incarceration, but not always, are as much about racial social control of surplus labor in Black and brown communities as they are about control of actual crime. Aggressive policing and other forms of justice system control, operation this and that, you name it, the labels change as you move from city to city, they actually, I think, manage perceived threats of criminality arising from mostly idle men in low-income neighborhoods as much as they respond to real crime. And so my hypothesis is that structural forces of labor dislocation, as well as hardening assumptions that equate low-income African Americans with prison, are actually key forces behind the persistence of mass policies of criminal justice control. As Todd and others have pointed out, the steep rise in incarceration rates is not fully explained by increases in crime that occurred in the 1970s and the 1980s, but instead result from policy choices that have disproportionately targeted low-skill, poorly educated men. Many of these people are folks who have been, or maybe their parents were, dislocated from employment markets as manufacturing jobs moved overseas. Between 1970 and 2000, the relative wages of Black men increased in major urban centers, but the annual earning of those men actually fell as compared to their white counterparts. This discrepancy is largely explained by declining labor market participation by Black men as they found fewer weeks of work or stopped looking for employment altogether. Young Black men obtained actually no benefit at all, either in absolute employment or relative wages during the record-breaking economic boom of the Clinton years, when the rise in incarceration was actually most acute. So I would argue that high rates of unemployment and a shrinking job market overall have helped to maintain support for those long sentences for drugs, armed robbery, burglary, and other crimes typically associated with perpetrators of color, even as crime rates have dropped and government officials look for other ways to cut prison budgets. I think that racial fear, which is hard to quantify in an analysis, but most definitely baked into the stew, figures strongly into the equation here, and that we have to account for it as we craft strategies to unwind some of the damage that we've done. Now, I will fully acknowledge that the recent drops in incarceration that we've seen in some jurisdictions, most notably our own New York State, offer some contrary evidence to what I'm arguing. The felony conviction rate in New York City has dropped by some 32%. As Judy mentioned, the overall drop in incarceration in New York State has been about 25% since 1993. However, at the same time that felony arrests have declined, the use of stop and frisk policing has escalated, and misdemeanor arrests for petty crimes has soared. We still have huge numbers of people that we're churning through the system. And it seems to me that to focus only on incarceration obscures a much larger phenomenon of criminal justice social control. It's the stop and the frisk, it's the citations for often subjective public disorder offenses, it's the expansion of systems of probation and parole that both limit employment prospects and increase an individual's risk of future incarceration. My friend Deborah Smalls, who some of you may know as a longtime advocate in the drug policy reform movement, likes to say that you can reduce incarceration. In fact, I think she says New York City proves that you can reduce incarceration and still really screw up people's lives. Now, of course, she used a much saltier word than that, but the point is really the same. And so I think it's important for us to talk about policies of mass criminalization and not just about policies of mass incarceration. And so while much of the criminal justice literature in the last 15 or so years and much of our advocacy treats unemployment as a collateral consequence of mass incarceration, I would argue that declining economic prospects for low-income residents of color, in particular, is also a causal factor that helps to sustain high rates, or at least higher than merited rates of imprisonment and intensive criminal justice control. And I think we need to think about these surplus labor dynamics as we talk and think about strategies to address mass incarceration. Bruce Western, who many of you know, a brilliant scholar at Harvard, observed in a book about 10 years ago that grand projects in crime control often spring from deep fissures in the social order. The fissure here, I would argue, is not just civil rights backlash, as several new Jim Crow scholars have argued, but also a widening income gap and a transformed economy that has increasingly consigned certain groups to the labor market slag heap. And so I would argue that one of the factors that's driving the intense cycle of stop and frisk and sustaining political support for long sentences are deep-seated racial fears of unemployed, mainly unemployed black men, and the threat of disorder that they evoke in large segments of the population. I think it's unlikely that we would be locking up so much human capital or so willingly undermining so many young people's employment prospects with petty arrests were there a place and a real demand for these particular young people in the economy. So I think while there's undoubtedly as much pot smoking and dealing going on among 20-something tech entrepreneurs in Manhattan as there are on the streets of central Brooklyn, it would be unthinkable for the NYPD to stop and frisk them as they emerge from their loft offices in Williamsburg or Soho, as we regularly do to Black and Latino youth on their way home from school. So it seems to me that despite the encouraging progress that we have made in stabilizing incarceration rates and even bringing them down, I'm not sure that I'm as hopeful as Todd and others are, because I think what we have to account for and counter-program against is a powerful countervailing instinct to to continue aggressive policing in communities of color with high rates of unemployment, and to maintain the long sentences that we're all here talking about. So I guess what I'm saying is that we somehow have to account for the extracurricular work that the criminal justice system is doing, which is not so much about crime, but really about racialized social control, particularly of populations that are now in our economy surplus labor. And so my point is that the political will that we'll need for a more thoroughgoing type of reform may not materialize unless more is done to connect poor residents of color to decent education and stable work in a transformed economy. I think we need a justice reinvestment approach that focuses at its core on the redemptive power of education and employment of young people at greatest risk for incarceration. Todd has done some really important thinking on this. He's called for a reinvestment of prison savings and voucher systems that might pay private employers a monthly subsidy for hiring a former prisoner or an at-risk young person from a high incarceration neighborhood. I also think that we have to really think deeply about alliance building and how we build the political will to make some of these changes. In recent years, much of my work for Atlantic Philanthropies has focused on the so-called school-to-prison pipeline. And so I found myself at many conferences and meetings with educators, K through 12 educators across the country. And my sense is that there are allies to be found in the world of K-12 education reform. Now, that whole debate about education reform exists in a parallel universe from this one, but I think really ought to be connected. Sometime in the last 10 to 15 years, corporate leaders began to wake up to the economic implications of the fact that American students were falling behind their international peers in virtually every measure of academic achievement, most especially in the sciences. And in truth, the sad reality is that the US is facing a serious shortage of professionals who will be crucial to our global competitiveness. A corollary concern of educators has been the persistent academic achievement gap between whites, Hispanics, and Black children, especially at a time when the nation's white population is shrinking and the entry-level workforce is increasingly made up of people of color who are underrepresented in high-skill fields. So when you go to these conferences, you hear national education leaders, whether it's Arne Duncan or the head of some corporation or Bill Gates, that are pointing to the state of public education in general and the achievement gap in particular as a house on fire. For the first time in my lifetime, and maybe even in the history of America, you have a racially and politically diverse set of actors who are calling for and keenly focused on improving educational outcomes and college-going prospects of poor minority children. This ranges from Black Wall Street managers to conservative corporate philanthropists to Teach for America alumni. It's really a fairly extraordinary coalition. Yet at the same time that business and education elites are overhauling course standards, rewriting curriculum, upgrading teacher evaluation systems, pervasive experiences of criminalization and school exclusion among young people of color, whether experienced directly or through familial networks, are significantly undermining these very efforts to close achievement gaps and to raise graduation rates. And I'll offer just a few examples of the bleed of criminal justice to education. In the mid-1970s, police patrolled about 1% of schools. By 2008, the figure was 40%. 15 years ago, in 1997, there were fewer than 10,000 law enforcement officers in school buildings around the country. Today, it's about 17,000. In New York City itself, the public schools now maintain a school security force of about 5,000 officers. That's a number sufficient to constitute the 5th largest police department in the nation, were it organized as an independent force. During the same period of time, the use of metal detectors, wands, pat-downs at schoolhouse entrances have proliferated. And here in New York City, suspensions increased by 40% between 2006 and 2012, even though reports of school violence were down by 37%. And much like the quality of life offenses that are prosecuted so heavily in Black and brown communities, the vast majority of offenses for which young people of color are disciplined in school and referred to the juvenile justice system are quite minor in nature. It's talking back to a teacher, it's refusing to pull up your saggy pants, it's truancy, and other kinds of disorderly conduct offenses. But what I think we have not talked about enough, either the school to prison pipeline people or the educators, is what are the implications of these practices for student success. At Atlantic, we funded a small study last year by Dr. Robert Balfonts of Johns Hopkins University, who's perhaps the nation's leading scholar on graduation rates. And his research found that a single suspension in the 9th grade doubles the likelihood of course failure and dropout. It triples the likelihood of juvenile justice involvement. Second, there's an emerging body of survey research, some of it done right here at John Jay, suggesting that experiences of criminalization in school are causing young people to disengage from schools that they view as prison-like institutions rather than supportive climates for learning. Third, I think that in the era of mass incarceration, now, as Todd suggested, into its second generation, has reinforced what George Bush famously called the soft bigotry of low expectations, by hardening assumptions that equate young people of color with prison rather than productive employment. And so while at these conferences I go to, the speakers regularly exhort teachers to believe in the learning potential of every child, and that's with like triple exclamation points, the harsh truth is that educators in racially isolated schools in communities around the country are well aware of their students' prospects. They are well aware that 1 in 3 of their male students are headed for prison or criminal justice control. Fourth, I would say that pervasive experiences of surveillance, whether personal or, again, experienced by family members, are doing deep psychic harm to the self-esteem and collective aspirations of young people who have already accepted prison as the norm. Punitive policies of social control in school and on the street contribute to a vicious cycle of dropout, unemployment, and further incarceration by making it really difficult for young people to imagine a different future. So I really think there's a larger conversation to be had with business leaders and with K-12 education leaders about the undertow that criminal justice policies are exerting on student success. There's an emerging body of research of deep, deep interest to educators, for example, on the important role that student optimism and perseverance, what the researchers call grit, student grit, play in educational success. And when I read this research, I just want to ask, if the antithesis of grit and optimism is a lack of hope, what are the implications of this research for children who see joblessness and prison as their future? Or for a school full of students who have a parent, an aunt, uncles and brothers who are locked up? So I would say yes, we need corrections experts and criminologists to work on the mechanics of de-incarceration, but I think we also need more attention to labor market solutions, the creation of job incentives for employers, entrepreneurship programs that allow young people to build their own businesses and sidestep some of the existing minefields of the current labor market. Second, I think we need to replace discipline practices that exclude and criminalize children with positive discipline approaches, strong student-teacher relationships, academic rigor, all of those things that build a climate for learning and engagement in school. And third, and finally, I would say we need an expanded table of actors working on criminal justice reform that include K-12 educators and business leaders who have been educated and hopefully radicalized about the percussive effects of criminal justice control on their own students and their ability to raise the bar. So thank you for listening.